Resident Evil Revelations 2 takes place between the events of Resident Evils 5 and 6, and is told in between two different time periods. The first involves Raccoon City survivor Claire Redfield and the daughter of Barry Burton, Moira Burton. As the two ladies are at a party celebrating the creation of a new biohazard prevention agency named TerraSave, they are suddenly kidnapped and taken to a secluded island, and when they awake they discover that them, alongside a few other TerraSave employees, have been injected with some form of experimental virus and are wearing bracelets which can somehow measure their fear levels. As they are contacted by a mysterious woman which she calls herself the Overseer seems to be overlooking an experiment, and Claire and Moira must work together in order to fight their way through hordes of mutated enemies in order to escape the island. In the second plotline, Barry Burton goes on looking for his daughter sometime later, and once he arrives on the island that Claire and Moira were being held on, she happens to run into a little girl named Natalia. Together, Barry and Natalia explore and discover the whereabouts of Moira and discover the true identity of the Overseer, who somehow has a connection to an old enemy.
Now, in my opinion, the story to Resident Evil Revelations 2 is not bad at all, but I really feel like Capcom really dropped the ball at this one because, in my opinion, this game has absolutely no business taking place between the events of Resident Evil 5 and 6. You get a single reference of Ouroboros at the beginning of Barry to henceforth notify that this takes place after 5, and you get a little mention of Piers and a new virus strand indicating that this takes place around the events of 6. But the problem with that is that since we're working with characters which are completely alien to this certain scenario that we were in, it just feels disjointed. The reason why Revelations 1 worked so well was that we were playing as Chris and Jill, so we got to see what they were doing leading up to their encounter with Wesker, which would take us into 5. But since we're working with completely different elements, it just feels a little bit disconnected, and it feels like it belongs elsewhere. If anything, the story for Revelations 2 should have involved the characters of Simmons and Carla, and this island that we're on probably should have been the testing ground for the C virus, indicating this is where it all started leading up into 6. The Revelations game has to support the events of the main series of games, and Revelations 2 does not do that at all. It would have been much stronger had it just read in Resident Evil 7, and heck, there's a new antagonist that this game introduced, which is a pretty significant character, which would have made for a really great encounter had Jake Muller been involved in this particular game. So, if you're a fan of Resident Evil games, you might end up enjoying this, but if you really look deeper and try to connect the dots, I just feel that in a whole, this one is just completely out of place. A good story, just taking place at the wrong time.
The gameplay for Revelations 2 is reminiscent of the co-op partner system from Resident Evils 5, 6, and Revelations 1. However, this time around, it is much improved upon, making the use of teamwork essential to the progression of the game. No longer are you stuck with a co-op system which allows two characters to play completely identical to each other, and to some degree, if you choose to play solo, you will not have an AI partner that makes the game frustrating. What makes Revelations 2 co-op system better than its previous installments is that each party has an offensive character and a support character. The support characters, in which they are Moira and Natalia, have particular functions which will significantly aid the offensive characters, which are Claire and Barry. Between Claire and Moira, due to Moira's fear of guns, Claire is the only one who takes care of all the shooting, and although Moira does carry a crowbar that she can use as a melee weapon, her main tool is a flashlight that she can use to blind enemies, giving Claire an opening to an attack. Between Barry and Natalia, Barry is obviously going to handle all the shooting, while Natalia has the unique ability to see enemies through walls and objects, and in many situations she can even spot out specific weak points on enemies, and can even spot out enemies that are invisible to Barry. Therefore, you can actually use her to guide Barry onto the target. When you're playing solo, knowing when to switch between these characters is essential to this version of Resident Evil's co-op gameplay mechanics. To upgrade your weapons, you will find little toolkits hidden inside of cases, in which you then can take to workshop benches and attach these perks onto the weapon of your choice to increase its performance. You will also have the ability to upgrade your characters over the course of the 4 chapters. At the end of each party section of a chapter, you will gain points depending on how many enemies you killed during that particular section of the chapter, or performing specific actions, and with these points you can then upgrade particular functions of each character. Once you have completed the main campaign, you can then jump into raid mode, which works somewhat similar to the previous installment's mercenaries modes. However, there are some key differences. How raid mode seems to work is that you will start off by selecting a Resident Evil character to play. However, what makes raid mode different from mercenaries is that each particular character is not limited to a specific set of weapons, but instead can be customized to carry whatever weapon you want them to carry. As you take your selected character to missions of your choice, you will then be given specific objectives, which could range from simply killing all the enemies in your path, or defending specific locations as long as you can without dying. As you complete missions with the character that you've chosen, they will begin to level up, allowing them to gain access to much more powerful perks and much more powerful weapons, which you then can use to take down stronger enemies. What raid mode does is simply take the old mercenaries mode from the previous installment and gives it an RPG upgrade and customizable system. And it is clear that in terms of gameplay, whether you choose to play alone or with a friend, there is plenty of things to do and unlock within the main campaign or outside of it. Now, visually, Revelations 2 is not much of an improvement over Resident Evil 6, however, the camera movement did seem to be a bit smoother for me. The variety of enemies that you will encounter between both campaigns is quite limited, though in raid mode, old school fans will surely be surprised by the appearance of some old school type enemies. The boss fights in the game are much fewer than you would expect for a Resident Evil title. However, like all previous installments, they do require a bit of problem solving in order to find out their weaknesses. Though the atmosphere of being trapped on a deserted island is certainly a throwback to old Resident Evil survival horror roots, I couldn't help but just get the feeling that I had done all of this before in previous installments. Making my way through dark corridors and abandoned facilities just doesn't have the tenseful feeling that it once did for previous installments. Some of the music tracks I noticed were taken from previous installments, which certainly made me feel right at home as I was playing this game. However, one design element that I'm sure is exclusive to the PlayStation 4 only is that it does take advantage of using the speaker on the DualShock 4 controller in order to give the game a much more immersive feeling. But apart from that, there really aren't any differences between the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One versions.
In conclusion, Resident Evil Revelations 2 is somewhat of a mixed bag for me as a whole. In terms of story, it really dropped the ball big time of using a lot of the wrong storyline elements and being placed at the wrong time, and not even being inherently strong enough to have been told in 4 episodes, feeling that they needed to release this week after week after week. It just was completely unnecessary, especially once you really understand how little the story actually goes to explaining things. However, in terms of gameplay style, this is by far the best use of the new Resident Evil co-op system to date. It certainly has a lot of general old school survival horror feelings, and in my opinion, this is really the closest you're going to get to an old school style Resident Evil feeling with the new modern day Resident Evil gameplay format. I would absolutely recommend this to anyone who's an old school fan who is a little bit displeased with the new direction that the new main series has chosen to go to, which in terms of being more action based instead of survival horror based. If I had to give Resident Evil Revelations 2 a rating, it would have to be a 7.5 out of 10. A good game, certainly a worthy entry in the Resident Evil franchise, but it's not as strong as it could have been, having been placed where it is. If you like this game review, free to like, comment down below, and please subscribe to track me in my future movie and video game reviews. And like always, thank you guys for watching, you're awesome, and I'll see you next time.